All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Know Who Drives Return. I'm David Drapkin. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by the founder of the activist investor himself, Michael Levin. Michael's an experienced board director and an expert on all things activist investing. So, Michael, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
I am honored and delighted to be here.
Cool. Well, I know we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what's going on with Universal Proxy. So how about a little refresher on the changes to the proxy system and what Universal Proxy actually is?
So Universal Proxy affects how shareholders vote in contested elections or in proxy contests. It refers to a regulation that the SEC promulgated actually back in November 2021, was effective starting September 1st of 2022. So what we're going to talk about, Universal Proxy, applies to any shareholder meeting that took place starting September 1st, September 22. So anything in this year and thereafter will have to be run using a Universal Proxy. Universal Proxy refers to the idea that activists and companies need to basically use an identical proxy card, or shareholders might think of it as a ballot. Okay. Previous to this, a company would send out its own ballot, and an activist or an activist investor would send out its own ballot, and the two would not necessarily look alike. The company ballot would list only the company's nominees for a board, mostly incumbents who are currently on a board, and the activists would include only their candidates, which would make voting kind of hard. If you're a shareholder and you want to, support some of each, you really couldn't do that. Well, the SEC wanted to fix that problem, so they now require all the parties to use essentially identical ballots, listing all the people that are available, therefore allowing shareholders to, as we say, mix and match. So if you attend a shareholder meeting in person, which no one ever does anymore, I've done it. It's
virtual
different, but it's fun, but it's weird. You're handed a paper ballot with names listed, and you check off who you want. Okay, well, if you're voting by proxy, voting remote, not online, though, there's some nuance to that too. You only had these two choices: either vote for the company or vote for the activist, and you really couldn't express any kind of variation from that. Well, the Universal Proxy rule fixes this problem and now makes it very easy for shareholders, and the rule was really intended to help them, shareholders, to mix and match their selections from among and between the activist and the company.
Right. So having the ability to select individual choices of directors from both sides.
Exactly.
I still think people still go to Berkshire annual meeting and Walmart, but that's probably about it.
They go, and they don't go because they're voting on direct.
Exactly.
they're going for the spectacle,
right?
For the party, to maybe go buy some candy, to go maybe see Warren and Charlie speak, but not because
no one's going activist on Berkshire. But thanks for the refresher. So there's a lot of talk and lead up to the changes, particularly in your community and amongst the participants. So now that it's been 6 months after the fact of the actual implementation, how have contests been affected since the rule change?
That's a great question. Now it's early, both in the life of this new rule and also in the 2023 proxy season, as we call it. I never liked that phrase, proxy season. It seems like the weather should change or something, but they call it proxy season. We call it that too. So it's early, but there are nonetheless some early indications about how it's working, and we could think about that in two ways. First, looking at the proxy contest that had kind of been announced. And sort of what's in the hopper. And then we can look at the proxy contests that have actually concluded, that have voted under universal proxy. For the first group, the proxy contests that we've sort of seen so far that have just been announced, there's not that many. When I counted last week, there were 27 proxy contests that have been announced since Jan 1, which isn't that many. The board composition that people were looking for was the activists were looking for about a third of the available seats in those on average in those contests. And those two figures were pretty much consistent with what we'd seen the past 2 or 3 or 4 years before that. But there hasn't been this huge, groundswell uptick in number of proxy contests announced or what activists seem to be wanting out of those contests. But again, it's still early. In a given year, at least the past 3 or 4 years, we'd seen somewhere between 50 and 60 proxy contests in a given year. So we haven't seen that many relative to what we can expect. And right now is the time when companies are receiving their notices of what's going to happen, and when activists are starting to disclose what's going on. So we would expect to see in the next several weeks a large number of these starting to hit the media, hit Edgar, so forth. So we'll be looking pretty closely to sort of see how that behaves. So there hasn't been a huge change so far in that, but in terms of the ones that have had an outcome, it's been quite interesting.
Okay.
So there's only been 3 or 4 contests again that have actually had a vote, or gone that far, and 2 of them were settled before it actually got that far. We saw that the Disney Trian contest ended kind of abruptly, but that was going to go to Nelson Peltz was prepared to spend $25 million to get himself on the board at Disney. And then figured out that maybe it was going to be $25 million was not going to win it for him, so he rather not spend the money and he just claimed victory, which is I would do that too. And there were a couple others which kind of ended early. There was one that concluded, and it worked out really well for shareholders, for activists.
Right.
That was.
Would you say that this level of settling versus going to an actual vote is in line with historical percentages, or?
I think so.
Yeah.
But up till now, if you look at this year, only about a third of the proxy contests that were announced were concluded, most by settlement. In previous years, at this point, a half or more of the contests that have been announced had been concluded, usually by a settlement. So settlements are down a little bit, but the sample size, so to speak, is kind of small.
Yeah.
So it's not quite clear, but at least based just on that data, people are not necessarily settling as quickly as they might have. And there have been a couple notable settlements. Starboard settled with Rogers last week. That was going to be a tough contest for Rogers, especially under universal proxy. So they probably very wisely, when you're up against someone who's as shrewd and well funded as Jeff Smith,
right?
You probably want to make that one go away, which they did.
Right.
So anyway, so the one contest that we've seen so far worked out really well. That was the land and buildings apartment investment management one. That worked out really well for shareholders. It worked exactly as the SEC intended. Shareholders were able to split their vote very easily. They mixed and matched. ISS advised they mix and match. So ISS kind of prevailed here, institutional, the proxy advisor. So that worked out really as intended. If they go if others start to go that way, boards are going to be really wary about what they do here. So that's kind of how proxy contests have sort of started.
And to refresh, in the land buildings AIV situation, it was like 2 nominees by the activists, and one of the 2. Or is it one of the 3?
Yes,
wound up getting elected.
Right. So that was AIV as a board it's a classified board of 7. So only 3 seats were up in the 2023 shareholder meeting. Okay, and so of course AIV nominated all three incumbents, and Jonathan Litt at Land and Buildings nominated two people to run for those three open seats. So there were 5 people running for 3 available board seats, 3 incumbents, 2 of activists. And ISS recommended that shareholders vote for 2 of the AIV incumbents and 1 of the Land and Buildings challengers. Okay. Interestingly, Glass Lewis voted for recommended that its clients vote all for the incumbents.
Really?
Okay. Yeah.
There's a little split advice there.
Yes. And what happened was that the 2 incumbents that ISS had recommended for, and the one challenger that ISS recommended for from Land and Buildings, all 3 won by like significant margins, by like going away, just like, I mean, twice as many votes as the 2 losers. I should call losers. I know. 2 people
vote getting, not
right. And so shareholders were able to express their preferences with precision. ISS made a recommendation, and it prevailed. So this is exactly what the SEC intended, and what shareholders have been wanting for a long time. Is the ability to kind of express your preferences pretty directly about how much change you want in a company.
Right.
That's that happened here.
Right. And yeah, it's interesting that the kind of the first one to go to vote, had only a portion of the challengers, the way it was intended. And so what have like the activists done to take advantage of the new rules?
Right. So again, while the rule was really intended for shareholders to allow them to vote, obviously activists, and I suppose companies will, activists in particular, have needed to think a little differently about contests, okay, than they have in the past. First, contests are a lot more personal. Okay. In the past, an activist would just say, vote for our people and against their people, or this is my thesis for the company and it's better than what the incumbents are doing. And it was just very binary. Okay. The choice now has transformed into a continuous situation where you can shareholders can vote, for exactly how much change they want in a company. And smart activists are starting to reflect that. And in particular, they are making it really easy for shareholders to compare their challenger candidates to the incumbents, to the weak incumbents that they're going after. Okay, and Nelson Peltz did this at Disney until he stopped the contest, but he was comparing himself as a governance expert to this one really less experienced director at Disney who really had never really sat on any kind of board before, and really didn't have any kind of company experience or whatnot, and really made that comparison very personal and very direct. Land and Buildings did it too. They said, here's our 2 candidates, here's their 2 candidates, and the third person that eventually there was a third incumbent. Land and Buildings said, fine, we can take them. So they're making this very personal and looking deeply at people's credentials and backgrounds and experience and weaknesses and so forth. And directors are having to kind of prove their value in ways that they never had before, and activists are taking advantage of that. That's one big thing that they're starting.
Do you think there are different things in a director candidacy because they're being looked at more on an individual basis that are important for shareholders that maybe weren't in the past, or is it's just a straight competition?
I think and again, some activists are doing this well. There's going to be a need to connect director and candidate qualifications much more closely to an activist thesis. Okay, it's not just enough to get some business luminaries who would be good on a board. But a smart activist says, here's what I want to accomplish at a company. Here's their weaknesses in governance. Here's their problems with exec comp. Here's the problems with capital allocation, whatever your thesis is for the company. And you need to then find candidates, nominees who directly support that thesis in a much more relevant way. Okay, it's not just enough to say I got a great plan for the company. Here's a bunch of people that are good. And similarly, companies are going to have to say, this is why this person's on the board, and this is what we're trying to accomplish at our company, and this is why this director is appropriate for that. Okay, so connecting candidate qualifications and director qualifications much more closely to what you want to do with a company is going to be a lot more important. Again, so it's not just I got a financial expert and he's good on an audit committee, or I have someone who was a former CEO in a related business or something. So that's one of the big changes in candidate qualifications is not like financial expertise is much more or less important. It's how they relate to what you want to do with your thesis for the investment.
Align the thesis. I know it's early. I guess it'll be interesting to observe over the course of whatever the next situations are. If you, as an expert, can notice any differences in the types of folks that are getting nominated versus the past.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of a continuation of some of the efforts toward diversity, more unique qualifications and so forth. Universal proxy is mostly just reinforce that how that will continue and help enhance your conviction that that's a good thing to happen. So there's no really kind of newish kind of candidates. A lot more women, which is good. Joining boards and so forth, which I would endorse. So yeah,
for sure. We're certainly seeing an uptick in the percentage of females that are taking the new board seats, and that continues to grow. And there's fewer and fewer, although it is surprising that we do still see some all male boards out there.
That's crazy. I don't know how a nominating committee allows that to persist is just beyond me.
Right. I assume you'd expect most people to get in compliance over the next year or so, but who knows? But that brings us to the companies themselves. So how do the companies and boards react or respond now that they're
there's one set of bad responses that they've done, which is to try to make life harder for activists. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable.
You're going to agitate them.
Be perfectly expected, but I don't like it. And that's mostly in the form of trying to tighten up bylaws, making it harder to nominate candidates, tightening advance notice bylaw terms, just kind of fighting off activists a lot. Because there's perception that the universal proxy is going to make life a lot easier for shareholders, which in part it does. The better response would be two other things that companies have done kind of weakly or not well in the past, which would be better board refresh and better shareholder engagement. Okay, now part of the problem is board refreshment. And I've been on boards. If most of the time it's like sending her on a questionnaire and saying you still want to serve. And here's the number of meetings you missed this year. Okay. And companies are going to have to do this a lot more seriously. Really look at candidate qualifications and how they support what you want to do with a company, how weak somebody is relative to potential challengers. Okay. And have really hard conversations with some directors who've been around for a while and say, look, it's time.
Right.
What you bring to our board is not necessarily what we need. The problem is, look, if a company doesn't want to engage in serious board refresh for themselves, an activist is going to do it for them. And the boards may not necessarily want that to happen. So board refresh is something that they're going to have to start to think much harder about. And the other is shareholder engagement. And part of the problem with shareholder engagement is that it's a lot of the time it's left to IR or maybe some senior executives executives and so forth reaching out to shareholders, because, directors are told, they're advised, you really can't talk to shareholders yourself. I need a lawyer in the room or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's wrong. There should be a much more concerted outreach from directors, elected directors, who are, supported by who are elected by the shareholders to represent their interest, reaching out to the shareholders, having directors, establish regular contact with some of the biggest shareholders. And what's critical there, we alluded to the personal nature of contact. Look, if you're a senior portfolio manager, you're on the proxy department at some big fund, okay, and you already have a relationship, a decent personal relationship with one or another director at a company, it's going to be a lot harder to vote against them.
Yeah,
you really will have established some sort of a rapport, and you may not agree on everything, but just the idea of the directors reaching out to the people who control those votes makes it a lot harder for those votes to be cast against when an activist comes knocking on their door. So that kind of shareholder outreach, which very few companies are really want to do.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So we'll start to see those two responses from companies rather than onerous bylaw changes that make life harder for activists.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could do the bylaws. It's interesting. You brought up board refresh. That's a theme that, I've spoken to some other folks about, really doing, better board effectiveness, better board assessments versus just, the surveys you mentioned.
Yeah, do the center on the questionnaire and sort of see if you're interested in serving it. Yeah. Are you okay with your committees?
Yeah. No, I'm okay getting my $400,000 a year to
yeah. Absolutely.
Do you still want to serve? Yes.
So, sure. Yeah, okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, fine.
Exactly.
Okay. I'll spend another 20 hours a year doing this. All right. Anyway.
Exactly. But a lot of folks, at the beginning, we spoke to also, it was like, oh, universal proxy's coming. There's going to be a million situations. But to your point and others, like you still have to, and you mentioned Nelson with 25 million. It's still, you have to cost money and you have to do the work, and the effort still exists to run the contest. So I assume your answer is no. So, but do you expect a flood of new situations because of?
I wasn't sure what to think, because before, last summer, before the effective date, there was a lot of there was some writing. I did some of it, and the SEC rulemaking provided a lot of economic analysis, and the rule reminded us that an activist or a dissident, whatever, doesn't necessarily have to spend a lot of money on a proxy contest. Proxy contests are not inherently very expensive. Okay, however, successful proxy contests might be. Okay, so while you may not necessarily have to spend a lot of money on a proxy contest, you may want to.
You may want, if you actually want to win.
If you or in certain situations, or a lot of bigger companies with lots of diverse shareholders, you may have to spend a lot of money to go get to these people.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So this perception that though it did remind us again with some very resourceful and clever promotion, you might be able to spend less than you thought. And we thought what it would bring out would be ESG proponents. Okay, that there are a lot of ESG proponents that write proposals, lots of proposals every year, lots of big companies, and their goal is to continue to increase the support that the vote that a proposal gets. You get a few percent more each year, you can point to success, and you can be on the agenda next year. Okay, and we thought that there would be ESG proponents that would not be satisfied with that, and would then use universal proxy and the perception of lower cost and so forth as an opportunity to maybe escalate their program for a company to the boardroom and look for directors rather than just merely, being satisfied with the proposal success.
Right.
Well, that hasn't quite happened yet. So I mentioned there were 27 or so proxy contests so far this year. They are all financial. or hedge funds or whatever. There's no, and as far as we can tell, none of the ESG proponents that we might have expected would have done this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, it's a little early, so we're expecting another, probably a few dozen more contests to be announced in this month and maybe next. So there may be some ESG proponents that come out and say, yeah, we're taking this step. But that's one thing we have not yet seen is those folks, moving beyond just writing proposals,
right?
Non-binding proposals, and then actually trying to find a director candidate at a company that hasn't made enough progress for them.
Right. So we're definitely seeing more ESG proposals for
Oh yeah. The volume of proposals is continues to go up.
Right. Yeah. Well, maybe this year it'll be an anti-ESG proposal.
I don't know. Maybe. Oh yeah. There's a few of those. There's what's his name? The Strive hedge fund CEO, who's now he's running for president now. But his fund is, I think, has submitted some proposals.
Yeah.
And there's a couple others that are doing, anti-ESG proposals. Yeah. But I don't think any of those folks are actually nominating director. I don't believe
it. They're not nominating director, at least not yet.
So that's one of the things that hasn't quite materialized yet in 2023.
Right.
There's there's some other signs that universal proxy is going to start having an impact.
Right. So far this year, a couple high profile activist situations, if you will. You mentioned Disney. Salesforce is in the news every day right now.
Salesforce, we haven't yet seen what the proxy contest situation looks like. There's just 5 or 6 activists all circling.
It's like
and trying to figure out who's
going to band together and create a super group to.
Well, you could do that. Part of the problem is you get 4 or 5, very successful, people I know, portfolio managers or CIOs or whatever, guys who run these. And there's some ego involved in trying to yield to someone else isn't always easy.
Right.
You have an idea for a company, what your company should do and so forth. You're not necessarily going to want, agree with others. So, that would be ideal for them and I suppose for shareholders. But again, we haven't seen yet what the proxy contest landscape looks like there. There was just some news this week or even today that Elliott Management is planning on nominating directors there. The window there is open another couple of weeks.
Right. We'll continue to follow. So what do you expect? Lastly, what do you expect in 2023? What should we be looking for?
I would expect to see a couple of ESG proponents come up with a nominee potentially. It's early to tell whether this is influencing more or less settlements.
Yep.
My default assumption is that boards of directors tend to be pretty risk averse. So if there's a threat, if there's a possibility that an activist is going to prevail, and universal proxy makes that even more likely, that they will settle pretty quickly. Which, for example, that's I think what we saw at Rogers with Starboard. That within a week of Starboard, coming up with a fairly resourceful and clever way to do this, Rogers just said, okay, we'll take one of your people, we'll agree on a second, and let's agree to move on. So that was pretty quick.
Yes, seemingly might be easier from the board's perspective to do that than engage in
and spending a lot of money, risking reputations. Again, a lot of these personal contests would be quite damaging to directors potentially. We've seen what would happen when a fund decides to really investigate or try to make it personal even before they had to. So yeah, some of that, there probably, another 25, 30 or so contests announced in the next month or two. And then we'll have a decent body of data to sort of see what the impact was in this first year.
Exactly. Well, hey, Michael, really appreciate coming on the update. Super interesting time for the space, and so we can continue to follow these situations, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you again.
My pleasure. Be in touch.